Hi there, this is S.J. Thomason with Christian-Apologist.com. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about moral values and duties and whether they're universal, objective, and grounded in a benevolent God. The reason I'm doing this is I'm expanding on a video I made earlier today on objective morality, and that video was in response to Scholar Fiction. I initially had scheduled a debate on the Modern Debate Day channel and with Scholar Fiction, and it was on objective morality and whether it exists. And so I would have used the moral ontology to make that argument. However, when I made the arguments by that video today, I noticed from the responses there seemed to be a little bit of confusion on some of the terms. And I realized that because I had pulled small portions out of a bigger article to make the video, that perhaps the portions that I had left were necessary to really explain the points. So I'm going now and making a longer video, and I hope you'll listen to the whole thing, but you don't have to listen to it all at once. It might not even be possible that you do because it is a bit long, but it's going to describe objective morality in much bigger terms. So we're going to understand these ideas in a much better way. So we start with looking at some questions on objective morality. Now, if something is objectively moral, it means that it's either right or wrong. And this right or wrong is not subject to the whims or opinions of anyone within any culture or generation or era. So it just stands alone as objectively right or wrong. So let me ask you this. You see here pictured Anne Frank, who wrote the Diary of Anne Frank and whose family was captured in the Nazi Holocaust and unfortunately executed. Also, you see other children here who were also victims of the Nazi Holocaust. The question is, was this atrocity morally and objectively wrong? I don't think you can make an argument that that's culturally contingent. The next question is the treatment of the babies of prisoners in Camp 14 in North Korea morally and objectively wrong? The reason I ask this is because at Camp 14, it's known for horrific treatment of people. People get so desperate and so starved that mothers actually eat their babies. And babies are born there, so they have done no crimes at all. And of course, some of the crimes that people claim when you're thrown in Camp 14 aren't crimes at all. There are maybe objections to this horrible government that they have over there. But anyway, the question is the treatment that they have over there morally and objectively wrong? What happens when the babies go into these schools is they're routinely beaten. And this boy right here, who's now a young man, had given a story about when he was beaten and how at one point he was hung from a hook. Yes, this is objectively wrong. Now let's think about what's objectively right. Is it morally and objectively right for a mother to love and care for her infant? I would say yes. Is it morally and objectively right for people to rescue others in Houston or other places where they experience natural disasters? I would argue again, yes. So we're going to go to C.S. Lewis and what he has to say on this matter. You find out more about God from the moral law than from the universe in general, just as you find out more about a man by listening to his conversation than by looking at a house he has built. Now, from this second bit of evidence, we conclude that the being behind the universe is intensely interested in right conduct, in fair play, unselfishness, courage, good faith, honesty, and truthfulness. In that sense, we should agree with the account given by Christianity and some other religions that God is good, but do not let us go too fast here. The moral law does not give us any grounds for thinking that God is good in the sense of being indulgent or soft or sympathetic. There is nothing indulgent about the moral law. It is as hard as nails. It tells you to do the straight thing, and it does not seem to care how painful or dangerous or difficult it is to do. If God is like the moral law, then he is not soft. For well over 100 years, Western societies have been trending away from traditional religious values and towards more secular, rational values. Within this trend is a movement away from supernatural explanations of observations in life to natural explanations. In recent times, debates between philosophers, psychologists, and evolutionary biologists have focused on whether our morality is only culturally contingent or universal and objective. People who argue for the latter often ask the question of whether objective morality exists, which is answered using moral ontology within a metaethical framework. Studies on this matter to date are descriptive. Others interested in explaining our moral prescriptions often turn to normative ethical frameworks, which focus on how people should act using deontological explanations or consequentialism. Scholars further argue for either supernatural or natural explanations of grounding. The present study examines and expands upon these arguments. To understand whether we have objective moral values, we apply metaethics. To understand how we should act if we have objective moral duties, we apply normative ethical frameworks. Better ethical decisions can be made when considering both normative ethical frameworks using Christian synderesis, intuitions, reasoning, and conscience. For over 2,000 years, scholars have formulated varying ways to explain ethical decision-making. In Western societies, Christian ethical frameworks dominated people's perspectives, yet modernism, in the first part of the last century, has increasingly supplanted Christian views with secular perspectives. Kim and colleagues underscored this view. They said, as modernism gradually replaced Christianity as the dominant worldview in the Western world, it essentially eliminated God from the public arena. Modernists believed the growth of newly discovered facts based on human reasoning and the scientific method would yield a unified answer for all knowledge and life. Yet, as they point out, modernism fails to comprehensively explain our reality and meaning, particularly with respect to ethics. According to Francis Fukuyama, the modern liberal project envisioned replacing community based on tradition, religion, race, or culture with one based on formal social contract among rational individuals who come together to preserve their natural rights as human beings. Rather than seeking the moral improvement of their members, modern societies have sought to create institutions like constitutional government and market-based exchange to regulate individual behavior. From the earliest days of the Enlightenment, conservative thinkers like Edmund Burke and Joseph de Maistre argued that such a community could not work. Without the transcendental sanctions posed by religion, without the irrational attachments, loyalties, and duties arising out of culture and historical tradition, modern societies would come apart at the seams. Postmodernism is a relativistic view, which came about after World War II and shifted attention away from grand narratives, such as objective truth and human nature. Postmodernists question the presence of any objective philosophical, scientific, or religious truth. This view is similar to moral relativism, which some believe better explains our reality than any objective or universal morality. Moral relativists believe that morality is culturally contingent. What is morally right or wrong depends on the prevailing norms or values of the cultures in which the moral actor is situated. Some moral relativists argue that moral decisions can only be judged within these boundaries, as they believe we have no universal moral values and duties. Others argue we have universal, objective moral values and duties. Moral values refer to whether something is good or bad, while moral duties refer to whether something is right or wrong, according to William Lane Craig. Quote from Rokeach, "To say a person has a value is to say that he has an enduring belief that a specific mode of conduct or end state of existence is personally and socially preferable to alternative modes of conduct or end states of existence. To say moral values or duties are objective is to say they do not vary as a function of a person's opinion. To say moral values and duties are universal is to say they are shared by all people globally, regardless of race, culture, sex, religion, color, and other demographic characteristics. They are the standards against which we judge practices, behaviors, and actions. For example, truth is an objective moral value whose meaning does not vary as a function of any one person or group of people. We assess whether someone is lying by matching his words or behaviors up against what we know as the truth. The golden rule is an objective moral duty whose meaning does not vary as a function of any person or group of people. We assess whether people follow the golden rule by whether and how their words or behaviors match up to a standard of benevolence. While universal moral values and duties often are also objective, there could be instances in which that is not the case. For example, if the Nazis had won World War II and taken over the world, forcing the world to discriminate against lesser races, quote unquote for lesser, discrimination would be considered a universal value, yet it would not be objectively right. It violates truths we hold to be self-evident, such as the intrinsic value of life, equity, equality, liberty, and justice. Some have argued that because objective moral values and duties transcend the cognitive limitations of particular individuals and are not restricted to the ethos of various cultures and eras, they must have been derived from a source that transcends the same boundaries. They argue that this source is an objective, universal, and intentional moral lawgiver. Examples come from Craig and Miller. Because in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, God is associated with ultimate goodness, and this is a quote from the Globe Study. Orders from God include specific duties and prohibitions that are associated with goodness and humanitarian behaviors. Some of the laws of God require humane-oriented behaviors and doing good to others, like almsgiving. Other laws require individuals to refrain themselves from directly causing harm to others, such as homicide or theft. Still, other laws require individuals to refrain from sensual enjoyment and hedonistic activities, such as adultery, consumption of alcohol, eating, fasting, or being lustful, end quote. Along similar lines, the seminal work of Immanuel Kant on deontological ethics made a case for a metaphysical foundation of our moral duties. Everyone must admit that a law, if it is to be valid morally, i.e. as the ground of an obligation, has to carry absolute necessity with it, that the command "you ought not to lie" is valid not merely for human beings, as though other rational beings did not have to heed it, and likewise all the other genuinely moral laws. Hence, that the ground of obligation here is to be sought not in the nature of the human being or the circumstances of the world in which he is placed, but a priori, solely in concepts of pure reason, and that every other precept grounded on principles of mere experience, and even a precept that is universal in a certain aspect, insofar as it is supported by the smallest part on empirical grounds, perhaps only as to its motive, can be called a practical rule, but never a moral law. Thus, a metaphysics of morals is indispensably necessary. And that's a quote from Immanuel Kant. Others have made arguments suggesting objective moral values and duties exist, yet they are not grounded in a transcendent moral lawgiver. In a recent debate at the New York Academy of Sciences, Michael Shermer argued for a naturalistic position in explaining objective morality, while Christopher Miller argued for a supernatural position. More specifically, Miller argued in support of an omnibenevolent, omnipotent, and omniscient creator of the universe as the source of our moral grounding. Shermer argued in support of unguided evolutionary processes and the desire to survive and flourish. Scholars who support moral foundations theory have posited that various objective moral foundations evolved to solve a variety of adaptive problems and selective pressures. Some have posited that the conjunction of these moral foundations and evolutionary adaptations may have increased the premium on mechanisms that inhibit moral transgressions. In other words, they have argued that people had a need to create an external overseeing and omniscient agent. According to Johnson in 2009, what better way to equip the human mind with the sense that their every move, even thought, is being observed, judged, and potentially punished? This is the view taken by people who believe that our objective morality resulted from evolutionary adaptations and is grounded in consequentialism, which is the desire to survive and flourish. Compare this with Mills, Rawls, or Harris. Which position is most valid? Are people from all parts of the world bound by the same universal and objective moral values and duties, or are they only culturally contingent? If universal morals and objective values and duties exist, are they grounded in a transcendent moral lawgiver, or are evolutionary adaptations sufficient to explain? I take the position that if moral universals exist, it follows that we have objective moral standards against which to judge human behaviors across cultures. So to address this, I must go to metaethics. Metaethics is a branch of analytic philosophy that explores the status, foundations, and scope of moral values, properties, and words, whereas the fields of applied ethics and normative theory focus on what is moral. Metaethics focuses on what morality itself is. Just as two people may disagree about the ethics of, for example, physician-assisted suicide, while nonetheless agreeing at the more abstract level of a general normative theory such as utilitarianism, so too many people who disagree at the level of a general normative theory nonetheless agree about the fundamental existence and status of morality itself, or vice versa. In this way, metaethics may be thought of as a highly abstract way of thinking philosophically about morality. For this reason, metaethics is also occasionally referred to as second-order moral theorizing to distinguish it from first-order level of normative theory. Let me explain what second-order versus first-order mean. If I say something is second-order, such as, for example, the construct of agreeableness in the five-factor model of personality, that is to say that that is at a higher level and there are lower level factors that factor into that. For example, as part of agreeableness, the empathy facet is present. And so it's one facet of many facets that together fall into the umbrella of agreeableness. Moral ontology is often confused with moral epistemology, so here I'm going to distinguish them. Moral ontology refers to whether moral values and duties objectively exist independently of people and are to be discovered by people. Ontology is defined as a branch of metaphysics that covers the nature of being. Moral ontology focuses on whether a standard of good and bad values or right or wrong duties exists. Moral epistemology refers to the knowledge of morality and how one comes to know morals and what's right and wrong. If one states that different cultures have different moral values and duties, one is applying moral epistemology. These are epistemological questions of how one comes to know moral values and duties. These are not to be conflated with whether moral values and duties exist. Some cultures may be closer to being right in their understanding of morality than others. Yet this does not mean objective rights or morals do not exist. It is a non sequitur to state that because different cultures have different perspectives of right and wrong, that objective standards of right and wrong do not exist. There are two types of moral ontology: moral realism and moral relativism. Moral realists believe that one truth exists and truth is unchanging and it's discoverable via objective measurements. This is a deductive approach, which goes from general to specific, which suggests that one can start from the generalization to make specific hypotheses about reality. Using the moral realism perspective, Hofster in 2017 helped to better define objectivity in morality, saying, "Consider the claim that the earth revolves around the sun. This claim is true, it states a fact, and this truth or fact is fully independent of what any agent thinks or feels about it. Similarly, moral realists maintain that moral truths or facts are fully independent of the attitudes of any agent." Similarly, Street in 2006 argued there are objective stance-independent moral truths. Moral relativists believe that truth does not exist without meaning, so truth is dependent upon the meaning you attach to it. Reality is created and it evolves and changes depending on one's context and situations. This is an inductive approach, going from specific to general, which suggests that one analyzes the specifics of various situations and transfers those specifics to other contexts. Moral ontology usually employs an etic or more quantitative and objective methodology, versus moral epistemology uses an emic, more qualitative and contextual approach. Consider this with a fishbowl analogy. If one is applying an etic view, one would analyze the fishbowl of a culture from an objective position outside of it. If one is applying an emic view, one would analyze the fishbowl from within the fishbowl. Moral ontology dictates one's epistemological beliefs. In other words, what people believe about the reality will influence the relationship one thinks one should have to reality. I will next expand upon these concepts with a discussion of moral relativism and moral universalism. I'll follow with a discussion on several possibilities that scholars have used to ground morality, which include biological evolutionary heritable traits, social development processes, moral psychology, consequentialism/utilitarianism, and deontology. I will show how some of these means of grounding result in category errors. I will then summarize and synthesize the results using Christian synderesis. I will offer theories that will support the position that universal and objective moral values and duties are real, evidenced, and grounded in a benevolent God. Finally, I'll have summarized my basic arguments in a table, which is presented just prior to my conclusions. De Munich in 2015 discovered the repeated realization during teaching, but also during occasional consultancy work, of how astonishingly popular moral relativism is, not only among students, but also among managers and executives. If you start a training session or a class by saying that you think ethics is a matter of right and wrong universally, that some principles seem to be absolutely valid, or more modestly, that some management and business practices are, from an ethical perspective, definitely better than others, people raise their eyebrows and quickly come up with all kinds of examples to show you that ethics depends on people's culture or religion. From this observation, the relativist conclusion is quickly reached, and moral objectivism is rejected as an outdated notion. End of quote. De Munich attributed a portion of this trend to the prevalence of cross-cultural research in universities and businesses by researchers who focused on differences between societies in values, behaviors, and norms rather than similarities. Moral relativism comes in multiple forms, and it is the view that moral values and duties vary as a function of one culture, era, or subjective opinion. For example, when in Rome, do as the Romans. Bribery is acceptable here. Female genital mutilation is acceptable there. Breaking in 10-year-olds with sex is acceptable in the British Pitcairn Islands. De Munich cited two examples in which external observers failed to curb actions within isolated cultures due to their own desire to permit cultures to set their own rules, despite the ethicality of the particular rules. He identified the white mutineers of the Bounty, who have occupied the British Pitcairn Islands near New Zealand for the past 200 years. They routinely break in their young girls as young as 10 years old by having sex with them. He also identified infanticides in the Amazon rainforest by tribes who force parents to kill their young babies and toddlers who are born with birth defects, stating that those humans lack souls. Outsiders have failed to step in and stop the practices under the belief that the tribes have rights to establish their own sets of moral laws and rules. If we applied universal ethical guidelines to such situations, condemnation would more likely have occurred. Yet would such condemnation be fair? In other words, is humanity universally bound to the same sets of moral values and duties? Should we ensure that the International Bill of Human Rights by the United Nations is equally applied to all people on the globe? An equal application presents a norm that can be used to appeal against gross violations in human rights and can therefore be beneficial. Cross-cultural scholars in the last century made strong cases for either or both moral relativism and moral universalism, which acknowledges value differences between societies versus the idea of certain moral values and duties being universally applicable. I concur with them and also argue that we should consider both frameworks together rather than only one or the other. In other words, I would say that not to look at moral relativism as if it's the only system in action. There is some level of cultural relativism, certainly. Many scholars with similar ideas have built theories from the seminal work of Kluckhohn and Strodebeck, Rokeach, Hofstede, and Schwartz. In multiple studies of hundreds of samples in 82 countries and representing culturally diverse people of varying age, genders, occupations, and geographies, Schwartz drew a conclusion that he considered astonishing. After ranking 10 values in order of importance, results indicated universals in values. The vast majority ranked benevolence as number one and the most important value, followed by universalism and self-direction. Benevolence refers to kindness towards the in-group, and universalism refers to kindness towards the out-group and also towards the planet more broadly. Schwartz defines values as guiding principles in people's lives. They are standards or goals that guide actions, and they transcend specific situations or actions and are ordered by importance. Schwartz posited that having the pan-cultural values he discovered may be attributable to adaptations by humans to maintain order in societies over time. In other words, he made the fallacy of using epistemology rather than ontology to suggest why something exists. Along similar lines, Kinnear, Kearns, and Doutharibes consulted the religious texts and sacred writings of 7 major world religions: Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, Judaism, and Islam, to identify whether any universals could be identified. They further consulted atheist and humanist organizations, along with the United Nations. They found these commonalities: a commitment to something greater than oneself, self-respect, but with humility, self-discipline, and acceptance of personal responsibility, respect and caring for others, and caring for other living things and the environment. You can see how this goes quite similarly with what Schwartz found. In a similar study, Dalsgaard, Peterson, and Seligman in 2005 examined the ancient texts from 8 religious traditions. The authors found 6 recurrent values: courage, temperance, justice, transcendence, humanity, and wisdom. In a survey using psychological, historical, juridical, theological, and ethnographical research, Westmark in 1906 identified universals in the approval of honesty, charity, mutual aid, and generosity, along with the prohibition of theft and homicide. Henrich and colleagues in 2005 examined 15 societies, finding that fairness and trust were exhibited in all. Taken together, these studies indicate similarity in the universal, objective, self-transcendent foundations upon which to judge human behaviors and actions. Yet the question of grounding is still outstanding. What is the source of our universal and objective moral values and duties? Let's look at social development. Does our social development explain our universal and objective moral values and duties? Charles Darwin stated, "So in regard to mental qualities, their transmission is manifest in our dogs, horses, and other domestic animals. Besides special tastes and habits, general intelligence, courage, bad and good temper, etc., are certainly transmitted. With man, we now know through the admirable labors of Mr. Galton that genius, which implies a wonderfully complex combination of high faculties, tends to be inherited, and on the other hand, it is too certain that insanity and deteriorated mental powers likewise run in the same families." Since Darwin's time, we have been able to dial down on some of the causes of variability in human populations due to studies on phenotypes, which are observable characteristics influenced by our environments, and genotypes, which is our genetic code. Evolutionary biologists and psychologists often make cases that our moral behaviors can be explained as a function of humanity's adaptations to their environments over time. In other words, they make a descriptive case for morality, which is an attempt to describe an as-is conditions in practices and behaviors. The descriptive arguments in favor of moral evolution tend to focus on the idea that cultures adapted to their environments over time, both competing for resources and cooperating within in-groups to enhance their chances of survival. McKay and Whitehall in 2015 delineate the adaptationist perspective on religion, which is the view that some religious byproducts we have observed, such as pro-social behaviors, cooperative and competitive, or coopetition, may have become useful for the survival of individuals and groups as their cultures evolved. This approach helps to explain the growth of large-scale societies from smaller bands of hunters and gatherers, farmers, and local communities. They argue that small group psychology, in which families and small groups would hold cheaters and free riders accountable, would not work when societies grew into larger empires. In those cases, an external force was needed to monitor behaviors, which they proposed could be a god or gods. In other words, to them, religion provided a needed system of external accountability. Some have also argued that as societies grew, rituals developed as a signal of good character, such as signals of trustworthiness and the willingness to cooperate, according to Bobulia in 2013 and colleagues. The theory of credibility enhancing displays, or creds, posits that some members in societies secured the trust and commitment from followers by becoming role models and walking the walk or talking the talk. By serving as moral exemplars, these people help to spread moral ideals through their societies. The creds theory helps to offer one potential explanation for the prevalence of gurus, role models, and formal or informal leaders within all religious groups who pave the example for their followers. These are a few of numerous theories and propositions developed in attempts to explain our social development. Yet these arguments fail. They fall within moral epistemology, not moral ontology. The way we developed our morality or moral epistemology does not address the question of whether objective morals and duties exist, which is moral ontology. To use our social development to posit non-existence of objective morality is a category error. The next thing we'll discuss is the heritability of social traits. Eilis Arvey and Bouchard in 2006 noted that traits, work attitudes, values and interests, and behaviors are heritable. More specifically, the authors reported that the heritability of intelligence is between 0.6 and 0.8. According to Bouchard, the heritability of the five-factor model of personality is 0.41 for emotional stability, 0.49 for extroversion, 0.45 for openness to experience, 0.35 for agreeableness, and 0.38 for conscientiousness, according to Leyland, 1992. Empathy is a facet of agreeableness. The heritability of positive and negative emotionality is 0.43 and 0.47. The heritability of a person's attitude toward being the leader of a group is 0.41. For all these traits, the genetic component is less than half because you have to square these numbers. Non-genetic components, such as the environment in which a person is raised, are each case more important in determining how people behave. These findings offer strong evidence against an evolutionary hypothesis for morality, according to Cy Gard, who is a professor and biochemist, in a personal conversation. As noted, while biologists and psychologists have described descriptively our as-is genetic predispositions and environmental influences on certain behaviors, they cannot explain our should-be moral oughts and duties. Moral ontology can be used to claim that moral values and duties exist, yet normative ethical frameworks better explain how we should act using teleological or deontological approaches. Now we're going to speak about moral psychology. Haidt and Joseph surveyed evolutionary theories about human and primate sociality, along with lists of virtues and taxonomies of morality from psychology and anthropology to moral concerns or virtues that were shared widely across cultures. They established 5 foundations of morality: care, harm, fairness, reciprocity, in-group loyalty, authority, and purity, sanctity. Later, they added on liberty and oppression. These foundations are stance independent and objective. In other words, they do not vary as a function of anyone's opinions. 200 years from today, when no one currently present exists, these moral foundations will exist. They are unchanging standards to which human behavior aspires. Graham, Haidt, and Nozick in 2009 identified political variations in the attention to the 5 foundations. People considered more liberal on the political spectrum were primarily concerned with care, harm, and fairness, reciprocity, while more conservative individuals drew more evenly across all 5 foundations. You can see where some political candidates up on the screen varied in those foundations. Jonathan Haidt uses social intuition theory to make the claim that our moral intuitions about these values guide our reasoning. Moral intuitions and reasoning are the foundations of morality. I would argue that our intuitions and reasoning are guided by our conscience. Our conscience is the foundation upon which our intuitions and reasoning are driven. Our intuitions inform our reasoning, which in turn informs our intuitions. These mechanisms are part of the learning process, yet the process, if driven by our conscience. When we align our intuitions and reasoning to our conscience, our very nature is closer in alignment with our Maker. Our Maker is the source of our conscience, and the reason why we have a conscience. We are made in His image, which is why one of the unique features of our species is that we have moral code and a conscience. Some might argue that our intuitions are our conscience, but the two are distinct. Imagine yourself at the edge of a pond. You witness an alligator that grabs a little boy and drags him into the pond. Your intuitions are to stay alive for the benefit of your family. Your intuitions are to run and save yourself from the alligator. Fight or flight. You've been hardwired to want to run away. Your intuitions are in survival mode. Yet your conscience calls on you to rescue the little boy. Your conscience is at a higher level than your intuitions, similar to Maslow's self-actualization mode. Your conscience calls on you to risk your life to save the life of another. Osman and Wiegman in 2017 described a heated debate between a philosopher and 2 psychologists. Shaw, the philosopher, argued that the field of moral psychology lacks a moral compass and should acknowledge that it's a field, its dependency on psychological and biological facts makes it morally irrelevant and reveals nothing about moral propositions of a normative nature. The two psychologists, Haidt and Pinker, replied that their research was never supposed to be understood as a normative guide, and that this should not only be obvious, but is also explicitly stated in the works. One of the psychologists, Jonathan Haidt, directed his challenger to a passage in his book. It said, "Philosophers typically distinguish between descriptive definitions of morality, which simply describe what people happen to think is moral, and normative definitions, which specify what is really and truly right, regardless of what anyone thinks. So far in this book, I have been entirely descriptive." That's in 2012. In other words, Haidt's moral foundation theory should be used to demonstrate the 6 foundations identified by Haidt exist, but should not be applied to normative ethical frameworks as guides to human behavior. Normative ethical frameworks can instead be used to explain our moral prescriptions. In summary, the quest to understand the source of our objective morality, skeptics often use moral epistemology to explain how we came to be via our social development. They may also point to the heritability of our social traits. Yet, as noted by Cy Gard, the evidence suggesting nurture is a stronger factor than nature suggests that this argument is weak. They may further use moral foundations theory, yet this theory is only descriptive, as noted by Haidt. So let's speak of the normative ethical frameworks now. The normative ethical framework is a branch of philosophical ethics that concerns the study of action to investigate how one ought to act morally. Within the normative ethical framework are teleological ethics of consequentialism and utilitarianism and deontological ethics. Consequentialism falls in the normative ethical teleological framework. People who lean heavily on consequentialism make ethical decisions, consider the morally correct action to be the one with the best consequences. Consequences take into account both actions and everything the actions cause. English philosopher and economist John Stuart Mill in 1863 popularized consequentialism with what he labeled the greatest happiness principle. According to the greatest happiness principle, the ultimate end with reference to and for the sake of which all other things are desirable, whether we are considering our own good or that of other people, is an existence exempt as far as possible from pain and as rich as possible in enjoyments, both in point in quality and quantity. The test of quality and the rule for measuring it against quantity being the preference felt by those who, in their opportunities of experience, to which must be added their habits of self-consciousness and self-observation, are best furnished with the means of comparison. Mill further acknowledged the higher pleasures of the intellect and lower pleasures of the senses. In a similar vein, Harris in 2010 stated that which is morally right is that which maximizes well-being, which he defined as the maximization of pleasure and happiness. Happiness, also known as well-being or pleasure, is often considered to be the ideal consequence, so some adherents believe that this consequence grounds moral decisions. Yet I would make the argument that happiness is only a minor goal within a much more complex set of goals and ideals. Given the aforementioned studies of all world religions, atheism, and humanism, one should note that happiness is never mentioned. Instead, seeking purpose and meaning, benevolence, universalism, and self-direction are mentioned. These values, along with others identified in global studies, such as courage, humility, and temperance, do not necessarily correspond to happiness. Accordingly, consequentialism is using subjective appeals to happiness, and that does sufficiently not ground humanity's objective moral values and duties. A special form of consequentialism is utilitarianism, which accentuates the idea that we should do the greatest good for the greatest number of people. The greatest good is often that which maximizes happiness or well-being or pleasure over pain for the greatest number of people. In Rawls' theory of justice, he stated that each society sets its own moral standards. To set the standards, he argued that each society requires a certain set of initial conditions. Now note these initial conditions. These include rational actors and mutually disinterested parties. Yet human nature is often in opposition to these rather strict, somewhat extreme conditions. Compare what I'm saying with what Zollo and colleagues said in 2017. Behavioral economists have found that people are often predictably irrational, reference Dan Ariely, while agency theory has often been drawn upon to make a strong case demonstrating that people act in their own self-interest. Cross-cultural scholars who study values have found that humans don't act in rational ways always, and rationality is subjectively defined, according to Hofstede, and becomes problematic in cases of uncertainty. Rational or optimal decisions require that all alternatives to a problem are perceived by the problem solver, and in organizations, that is rarely the case, according to Tosi, 2009. Furthermore, the means people use to generate personal happiness may be at the expense of the happiness of others. Consider that the Nazi prison guards may have derived happiness and pleasure by torturing, starving, and murdering people, which is obviously egregious and morally wrong. Harris seemed to acknowledge this shortfall when he asked these questions. What if the laws of nature allow for different and seemingly antithetical peaks on the moral landscape? What if there is a possible world in which the golden rule has become an unshakable instinct, while there is another world of equivalent happiness where the inhabitants reflexively violate it? Perhaps this is a world of perfectly matched sadists and masochists. Let's assume that in this world, every person can be paired one for one with the saints of the first world. And while they are different in every other way, these pairs are identical in every way relevant to their well-being. Stipulating all these things, the consequentialist would be forced to say that these worlds are morally equivalent. Is this a problem? I don't think so. The problem lies in how many details we have been forced to ignore in the process of getting to this point. A fine mess you put us in there, Sam. Building on that point, it is noteworthy to consider that utilitarian corresponds to some social classes and some negative personality traits. People with higher scores on psychopathy, life meaninglessness, and Machiavellianism had higher endorsements of utilitarian solutions, according to Bartels and Pizarro. Reynolds and Conway identified a negative correlation between psychopathy and more deontological judgments. In other words, people who had higher deontological judgments or judging on moral duties had lower levels of psychopathy. Other scholars have found that when making moral judgments, members of the upper class attempted to maximize the gains for a group by expressing a willingness to take actions that harm some but help many, according to Coate, Piff, and Willard, 2013. Their tendencies to show less empathy increased utilitarian judgment. These arguments suggest utilitarian decisions are agent relative, not agent neutral, as others have argued. Holyoake and Powell argued for agent neutrality, claiming that what is right for one would be right for that group. Yet that is not necessarily the case. Consider an ethical dilemma in which a father in a burning building has the option to save his 3 children on one side or 10 coworkers on another. He will likely reject the greatest good for the greatest number of people in favor of following his duty to value his children's lives more. So what is right for one would not be right for the group. This dilemma is somewhat similar to the famous trolley dilemma, which is often used to force decision makers to choose either reason, using a utilitarian perspective, or to follow moral duties to act virtuously. Another shortcoming relates to the formulation of the greater good. If greater good is to be meaningful in the formulation of a criterion of morality, 3 conditions must be fulfilled. The good must have a single meaning. What is good in this unique sense must be measurable. And 3, the result of measurement must settle moral issues either directly or indirectly. Clearly, the necessary meaning of good cannot be specified in moral terms. What Rawls says of utilitarianism is true of all consequentialism, and I'm quoting Grissich. Its point is to define good independently and right in terms of good. And in general, consequentialists see this requirement and try to meet it. If consequentialists said that ethical considerations determine what a good consequence is, they would either be going in a circle or setting off an infinite regress, end quote. Utilitarianism as an explanation of our moral prescriptions is faulty for several reasons. First, assuming humanity shares a common goal of happiness, well-being, or pleasure is superficial, given our much deeper and more complex universal moral values that have been identified in multiple global studies. A soldier who shows great courage and takes a bullet for another soldier and dies did not do it to make himself happy. He did it because in that moment of time, he displayed his tremendous love for his fellow man. In the hierarchy of moral values and duties, love rests on top. Happiness may or may not be an outcome of love in this life. Second, defining happiness or well-being or pleasure-seeking as a good consequence while saying it is right to seek happiness, well-being, or pleasure is a mere play on words, leading to circular reasoning. Even if we change the goal to love or focused on our mutual duty to love, the thinking is problematic. Saying that it is good to love and is right to love, so we should love, is true. We have a universal and objective moral duty to love. But saying that we can agree on the goal of love or our duty to love, so therefore our shared goal, mutual agreement, are both the objective foundation and the shared goal duty we should achieve, is circular. It equates with saying that humans have an underlying principle to be moral and a goal of being moral. The goal is also the grounding of the goal. You can see right here, I said goal cannot be the goal setter. The outcome cannot also be the input variable, and an independent variable cannot also be the dependent variable in these regression equations. Using the popular being versus doing mode, consider that our conscience and intuitions are steeped within our nature or being. Our reasoning or goal setting is steeped in actions or doing. Accordingly, grounding our morality in our reasoning is flawed. It equates with establishing the goal or the value and then saying the goal or value is also the source or foundation of the goal. To put it another way, setting a goal is an act or doing while the grounding is being. One cannot conflate the two. Doing focuses on the impersonal external world in the act of setting a goal or getting something done. Being focuses on what's internal and personal to us, intrinsic to our very nature. Third, the assumptions of rational actors and mutual disinterest are not met when establishing social contracts or shared goals. People often act irrationally in their own self-interest. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the normative ethics deontological framework. The influential German philosopher Immanuel Kant is popularized a deontological view, which states that people should follow universal rules and norms on what ought to be followed. In his view, reason serves as a guide towards an action that fulfills what he labeled as a categorical imperative, which is a universal law or maxim. An action performed out of duty is one of moral character. Kant's categorical imperative states that people should act accordingly only to that maxim by which one can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. People are the ends, not the means to the ends, and valued equally. An action from duty has its moral worth not in the aim that is supposed to be attained by it, but rather in the maxim in accordance with which it is resolved upon. Thus, that worth depends not on the actuality of the object of the action, but merely on the principle of the volition, in accordance with which an action is done, without regard to any object of the faculty of desire. In a meta-analysis of 151 studies over 71 years, Villegas de Posada and Vargas Trujillo found support for Kant's conceptualization of deontology using reason as a guide for moral action. Deontology necessarily presupposes a rule-setting authority. Morality is a matter of finding the right rule. It is not affected by desire, weakness of will, or laziness. A moral rule is followed as a duty, although it needs to be backed up by authority. Some have argued that the authority is either an implicit social contract, a democratic government, or God, according to Holyoake and Powell. But if we have universal moral duties that transcend all people, eras, and types of government, it follows that the moral lawgiver must also transcend people and eras. Claiming we have implicit social contracts does not eliminate the need for moral lawgiver who established this social contract with all of humanity. Craig makes the argument that if objective moral values and duties exist, God exists. He states, there must be an infinite eternal mind who is the architect of nature and whose moral purpose man and the universe are gradually fulfilling, end quote. Given our universal moral values of benevolence and universalism and our universal moral duty to follow the golden rule, one can make the argument that the infinite eternal mind is the standard of goodness against which moral actions are measured. People have argued that because humanity has failed to understand and live up to the standards God has set over the centuries, that God's very nature is compromised. They argue that the presence of evil or moral actors discounts the standard of love and goodness. They argue that God's nature must be changing since societies have changed. But this argument is faulty. One cannot use moral epistemology to make suggestions about the existence of objective morality. Furthermore, moral standards of love, truth, courage, mercy, equality, and justice do not change as a function of our opinions or actions. Some psychologists have conceptualized deontology different, claiming that morality is based on moral intuitions and emotions concerning principles and duties rather than consequences, and utility providing reasoning. Haidt's work is one example using social intuition theory. It contrasts others. For example, Green and his colleagues used fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, on individuals to analyze their brain activity, while they considered various types of moral dilemmas. Results indicated the cognitive regions of the brain were more active when considering characteristically consequentialist type of arguments, while the emotional regions of the brain were more active when considering deontological types of arguments. Green concluded that deontological intuitions are based on heuristics, also known as cognitive shortcuts, so consequentialist judgments are more reliable. Others have opposed his conclusions. Lau argued that deontological judgments do not need to be the product of effect-laden responses, and intuitions are not heuristics. Heuristics can be based on reasoning, and the Kantian formulation of deontology was steeped in reason. Further, Lau argued that Green's results instead call into question the reliability of the consequentialist judgments, since impaired social cognition, rather than deliberate reasoning, corresponded to the utilitarian responses in the moral dilemmas presented. Variations in our moral judgments may be based on differences in the following: values, grounds, schemas based on rights and duties, concern for types of moral patience, utility functions for consequences, including harm, emotional responses such as a lack of empathy, cognitive capacity, and cognitive control. Variations may also be based on whether one is focused on and has distinguished descriptive, fact-based aspects of moral judgments from prescriptive or values-based aspects. Conway and Gawronowski conducted 3 studies finding variations between deontological and utilitarian inclinations. Deontological inclinations were related to empathic concern, religiosity, and perspective taking, while utilitarian inclinations were related to the need for cognition. They further found that cognitive load reduced utilitarian inclinations, while manipulations that enhanced empathy increased deontological inclinations. Researchers have also distinguished utilitarian judgments from deontological judgments as those where one must cause harm to maximize outcomes, while deontological decisions are those that reject harm. This is often explained using the trolley dilemma, which gives the decision maker a choice based on the hypothetical story of an observer watching a train pass by. The observer sees that if the train continues down the track, it will hit 5 innocent people. The observer can save the 5 people if he stops the train, but to stop the train, the observer will need to push an innocent man in front of it. The deontologist would choose not to push the man, while the utilitarian would choose to push 1 person to save 5. Given varying contexts, values, and situations, forcing a dichotomy between deontological and utilitarian decisions using unrealistic trolley dilemmas and the like seem restrictive. One might instead consider Christian synderesis. Zolo, Pellegrini, and Choppy identified the importance of bridging the gap between intuitive and emotional processes, or moral intuitions, with conscious and rational processes, or moral reasoning, to explain ethical decision-making. They related moral intuitions to Kantian Universalism and moral reasoning to utilitarian ethics. Quote, "Despite the different sophistications of the utilitarian approach, a common element of all these theories is that the agent is rational and able to evaluate the situation and its outcome. Definitely such requisites are not met by talking about intuition, especially the ability to forecast and choose the preferable outcomes. Conversely, universalism imposes that every act is performed according to general and transcendental moral principles." The authors used an influential Christian moral social doctrine, synderesis, to bridge the gap between the 2 viewpoints. Synderesis is an innate human habit that fosters moral judgment and triggers the virtue of practical reason. It is a correct habit that regulates intuition due to its innate nature, and it's present in every individual. In Summa Theologia, Thomas Aquinas referred to synderesis as the law of our mind, in other words, our conscience. It is an awareness or understanding of the principles of human actions. Practical reasoning moves one from awareness of the principles to conclusions on actions or decisions. Conscience then forms a judgment on whether the actions or decisions in alignment with one's nature, whether they are right or wrong. This chart outlines much of this. So you can see right here whether something is descriptive, prescriptive, the outcomes, whether it's subject to change, and the source. You'll notice that heritability is a descriptive item. So is social development, moral ontology, speaking of moral relativism, and moral ontology if you focus on moral realism, and moral psychology, such as Jonathan Haidt's work. The prescriptive idea can be described and explained best with normative ethics using deontology. Accordingly, I'm going to get to my conclusion now. In a longitudinal study of world values, Ron Engelhardt in 2000 identified trends away from traditional religious views towards secularization and rationality. These trends have manifested in a shift in views favoring naturalism and moral relativism, which is evidenced in university classrooms and academic scholarship. The intention of this video was to question the merit of cultural shifts away from supernatural foundation and explanations by examining and synthesizing the extant literature on metaethics, moral ontology, moral relativism, and moral universalism. I sought to answer whether people from all parts of the globe are bound by the same universal and objective moral values and duties, or whether our morality is only culturally contingent. The evidence presented suggests our morality is a blend of both relative and universal objective values. While scholars such as Gert Hofstede have provided strong evidence of variations between cultures in as-is values and practices, scholars such as those in the Globe study have provided evidence of both as-is practices and higher-level should-be values. Combined with results from other global studies led by Shalom Schwartz, Westmark, Heinrich, Dalsgaard, Kinnear, and others, we have striking evidence suggesting humanity has certain righteous moral imperatives. All humans, no matter the country, ethnicity, age, or gender, share the universal moral duty to do what's right and to strive for benevolence and universalism. Accordingly, I offer a moral argument for the existence of God. If humanity has universal objective moral values and obligations to do what's right, there must be a universal source of righteousness that transcends generations. Humanity has universal objective moral values and duties to do what's right. Accordingly, there is a universal source of righteousness, God. These findings support the assertion that we have a conscience and a moral compass which direct us to goodness. It follows that the source of our conscience is a benevolent, transcendent moral lawgiver. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul stated the following in Romans 2:15. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. Philosophers, evolutionary biologists, and psychologists have offered other explanations of our objective moral values and duties, which are captured in either evolutionary adaptations, social development, genetic influences, our environment, or objective moral theories. These explanations vary in moral epistemological or ontological approaches and in offering descriptive and prescriptive information. Rather than thinking these explanations are at odds with one another, falling into the modern debate trap that pits science against religion, one might posit a process-based view using synderesis reasoning. Social development and evolutionary adaptations may have been guided by a divine moral lawgiver who stacked the deck in favor of selflessness and humility over selfishness, ego, and cooperation, which is a combination of competition and cooperation. The heritability of social traits and the environment offers an explanation of the as-is predispositions in humans that make more or less probable behaviors. Moral foundations theory provides a descriptive explanation of objective morality, yet, like other social development and inherited traits, this theory fails to explain our moral prescriptions. Philosophers initiated explanations of our moral duties using the normative, moral, deontological, and utilitarian frameworks, which have been studied in recent years in a variety of disciplines, using various lenses and interpretations. While both frameworks are useful in understanding the ways we make ethical decisions, the deontological framework best helps us to understand the transcendent source of our moral grounding. I want to thank you so much today for coming. I hope that you'll choose to like and subscribe. I know that this was a long video, much longer than my usual videos, and this is full of all kinds of information. I have a link in the description where you can actually go to the study. I've written the study in one of my blogs, and I have a lot of references in that particular study, and I used a much more academic form than I use in some of these videos, so I hope you appreciated it. I hope you might use it in your studies of morality, and I hope you might like and subscribe and share this video with your friends. Thank you so much.